From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Okay, let us begin. My name is Carolyn Brown. I'm Director of the Office of Scholarly Programs and the John W. Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for a wonderful lecture by Professor William Roger Lewis on the end of European colonial empires. Today's lecture is presented jointly by the National History Center and the John W. Kluge Center. And let me say a word about both of these. The National History Center promotes research, teaching, and learning in all fields of history. It was created by the American Historical Association in 2002 as a public trust dedicated to the study and teaching of history, as well as to the advancement of historical knowledge in government, in business, and for the public at large. For more information, you can go to the center's webpage, which is easy to remember. It's www.nationalhistorycenter.org. I would also note that our lecturer today, Dr. Lewis, is one of the key visionaries who conceived the National History Center and its founding director. The Kluge Center, which is our space here, is co-sponsoring this lecture and promotes advanced research in the collections of the Library of Congress. Through a generous endowment from John W. Kluge, the center was established in 2000. The center supports financially some of the world's most senior scholars and the most promising fellows to conduct research here at the library. We also sponsor lectures, such as this one, seminars, and small conferences. And you can find more information about the fellowship opportunities and other programs at the library's webpage, also predictable, website www.loc.gov. Dr. Roger Lewis is the Kerr Professor of English History and Culture at the University of Texas, where he is also professor in the Middle Eastern Studies Department. Dr. Lewis is the author or editor of approximately 30 books, including the 5-volume Oxford History of the British Empire. His most recent book, which is a collection of essays entitled Ends of British Imperialism, The Scramble for Empire, Suez, and Decolonization, was published last year. Dr. Lewis is also chairman of the U.S. State Department's Historical Advisory Committee, a heartening body for many of us who didn't know they had such a group. Past president of the American Historical Association, and a special friend of the library. He serves on the library's Scholars Council, which advises the librarian about matters associated with scholarship and academia. Dr. Lewis is the inspiration behind the current seminar on decolonization that's being hosted here at the Kluge Center. It started on Monday and is being funded through a generous gift from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. I should say it's not just a matter of his inspiration, however. He's also rolled up his sleeves and is doing the hard work of leading the seminar, and we're delighted to welcome many of the participants here this afternoon and are particularly appreciative that Dr. Lewis is willing to share his knowledge and insights for this more public audience. So please, we have a real, I believe, exciting and inspiring talk. Please welcome Dr. Roger Lewis.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that very gracious introduction. Welcome to the seminar on decolonization. Welcome to the 15 historians at the beginning of their careers who for the next month will be pursuing their research here at the Library of Congress. Decolonization is the phrase we use to denote the disengagement of the European colonial powers from Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean though whether the colonies actually became truly independent or not is a different question. What I'll be doing this afternoon is giving you the background of the now distant age of European colonial rule. I will look briefly at the major European powers, the Spanish as well as the British, the Dutch as well as the German, and the Belgian and the Italian as well as the French. Now, this is an ambitious agenda, but I think the subject can be made comprehensible by beginning with the British view at the start of the 20th century, little over 100 years ago. In the British and other cases, I'll pursue the argument of the colonial state in its Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, British, French, Italian, and Belgian incarnation, and as it was subsequently known, the post-colonial state. In the early 20th century, colonial empires were associated with ideas of national greatness, competitiveness, and the survival of the fittest. The colors painted on maps over vast areas of Asia and Africa symbolized national power, prestige, and destiny. And could I have map 1, please, Sudhir? Colonies seem to enrich national character and to encapsulate national glory. The natives, as the inhabitants of much of the rest of the world were then called, were to be civilized, while the raw materials and other resources of the colonies would benefit the economy of the metropolitan country. But this popular view was not entirely optimistic or well-intended. Technological advance made it easy to believe in human progress throughout the world, yet at the same time, humanity seemed trapped in an evolutionary struggle. Only the fittest nations and the fittest empires would survive. Great powers should possess great empires, if necessary, at the expense of lesser empires. Before 1914, Sir Edward Grey, the Foreign Secretary, spoke of Portuguese colonies as sinks of iniquity or dens of evil, and thought it would be merely a matter of time until they were partitioned between Germany and Britain. The possessions of the weaker colonial powers would be absorbed by the stronger, just as the territories of the dying nations of Turkey and China would be annexed by more virile European nations. The drive for empire contributed to a spirit of ruthless militarism. It is thus ironic that the Portuguese, regarded at the time by everyone as the weakest of the European powers, virtually outlasted them all. Now, future historians, writing 100 years from now, when the general interest in the details of the European empires may have faded even more than today, will continue to record the phantasmagoric significance attached to colonies in the years before 1914. They will also note the frenzied energy of the explorers, adventurers, soldiers, missionaries, traders, and administrators who, for better or worse, tangibly extended European influence and affected the lives of non-Europeans throughout the world. Docks, roads, railways, plantations, and mines spread everywhere at the same time that Western goods and money penetrated non-European societies. The beginning of the century, in that sense, represented a Rubicon from which there could be no return. Indigenous societies would never be allowed to continue their own natural evolution. They would be modernized and, in some cases, assimilated. Imperialism would be the engine of social and economic change. Now, each nation possessed colonial empires, large and small, and not only believed in the necessity of empire, but each also possessed a sense of superiority as a governing race, and each possessed a divine mission to civilize the non-European world. This was perhaps a rationalization, but it also became a galvanizing force. The ethic of empire created its own dynamic. Rudyard Kipling wrote of the British mission, to us and not to others, a certain definite duty has been assigned, to carry light and civilization into the dark places of the world, to touch the mind of Asia and Africa with the ethical ideas of Europe, to give thronging millions who otherwise would never know peace or security these first conditions of human advance. In similar vein, the most eloquent of British proconsuls, Lord Curzon, wrote of the British Empire as the greatest instrument for good that the world has ever known. Now, the creation of the modern European empires was the work of a single generation whose lifetime extended from the last decades of the 19th century through the period of the First World War. The antecedents, of course, were historic. Fundamentally, the empires were the product of the Industrial Revolution and Europe's consequent lead over the rest of the world in technology and weapons, though this looks quite different as seen, for example, through Chinese or Arab eyes. Europe, in any case, became a powerhouse generating trade and commerce. In the last decades of the 19th century and until 1914, Europe expanded more rapidly than at any other time. By 1914, European sway encompassed some 85% of the world's surface. The British Empire alone extended over 1/4 of the globe and over 1/4 of its population. The revolution in medicine, as well as technology, enabled explorers to penetrate into the African interior and allowed Christian missionaries to establish stations throughout the tropics. The Western advance appeared to be irreversible. Now, let me place this first in a British context. The British Empire was distinct, among other reasons, because of India. Could I have map 2, please, Sudhir? India, an empire in its own right, extending over 1,270,000 square miles. Now, Texas is only 270 square miles, so India was 270 square miles plus 1 million square miles and possessed a population of some 300 million. But here is the astonishing figure. Only 1,000 British civilian officers of the Indian Civil Service ruled India. Now think of that for a moment. 1,000 civilians ruling a population of 300 million over a continent virtually the size of Europe. The civilian officers were backed up, of course, by the Indian Army and the British Navy, but nevertheless, this is an astonishing statistic. And the British Indian Empire, though the largest component, was only one part of a gigantic empire stretching the world over. I now begin with my tour of the European colonial empires, and could we return, please, to map 1. I start with the smallest of the colonial empires in the 20th century, the Spanish. The loss in 1898 of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines to the United States and the Pacific Islands to Germany reduced the Spanish Empire mainly to the Spanish Sahara, a protectorate in part of Morocco, and Spanish Guinea in equatorial Africa. You may have to stretch your imagination to see Rio de Oro in the northwestern part of the continent near Morocco. Now, the tradition of the old Spanish colonial empire nevertheless proved to be, continued to be significant. It was authoritarian, legalistic, and paternalistic, the forerunner of the 20th century colonial state. Of the lasting Spanish legacies, perhaps the most remarkable was the assimilation of the Filipinos to Catholicism and the Spanish way of life. The effective colonizers were not the Spanish sea captains and conquistadors, but the friars and monks who built churches and created parishes and schools. The class structure of the Spanish era remained intact, and the system of patronage continued into the era of independence. I want to mention the case of Spanish Sahara because it remains controversial, and recent work has argued that it has never been decolonized but merely taken over or usurped as part of Morocco. Now, since I've mentioned the takeover of the Spanish Empire by the United States, let me say that the territorial possessions of the United States, and for that matter, the empire of the Soviet Union, are beyond the scope of my comments this afternoon. But it is useful to bear in mind at the same time that the European colonial empires were expanding into Africa and the Pacific, in this case at the expense of Spain, the United States established a comparable empire on the remnant of the Spanish possessions. And Russia continued to expand and consolidate a huge land empire in Central Asia, which by the turn of the century had completed a vast railway network linking Siberia with Vladivostok, the major Russian port on the Pacific. The colonial domain of the United States included Guam, as well as the Philippines and Puerto Rico, as well as the Virgin Islands, which were purchased from Denmark in 1917. But the United States never described these colonial possessions as colonies, but as territories because of the American revolutionary and anti-imperial heritage. The acquisition of colonies, in all but name, caused ideological embarrassment. The United States and the Soviet Union were, in this respect, similar. Both consistently demonstrated an anti-colonial empire, though both had colonial empires of their own. Now, to contemporaries observing the fate of the Spanish Empire, much of which was taken over by the United States, it seemed inevitable that the weak had given way to the strong. No one anticipated that the lifespan of the great colonial empires would be relatively short. The preponderant view at the turn of the 20th century held that the new empires would last for at least 1,000 years. Yet within 100 years of what the Spanish called the catastrophe in 1898, even the empire of the Soviet Union had collapsed at the end of the last century. Now let me begin to elaborate the argument that I'm presenting, so far implicit, and I now want to make it explicit. So here it is. It concerns what one writer has called the mythological beast of the colonial state, referred to by earlier writers such as J.S. Furnival as the colonial Leviathan, which possessed certain qualities of the European states. The colonial regimes, known collectively as the colonial state, were nascent sovereign units. The colonial state collected taxes and defended frontiers. Its character varied slightly from French to British, from Dutch to Portuguese and Belgian, and with few exceptions, each colonial regime attempted to become economically self-sufficient. In the stage of military conquest, which lasted roughly up to 1914, the colonial state conscripted labor in such projects as road building and railway construction to create the basis for self-sustaining flows of revenue. At its high point in the interwar years, the colonial state reached the extent of the police and the degree of productivity, while it encouraged indispensable collaboration of indigenous regimes, soldiers, clerks, traders, and later journalists. In the last stage, after World War II, the collaborators increasingly became nationalists who used Western languages to define their own ambitions as well as national identities and to wrest political control from the Europeans. The legacy of the colonial state helps to explain the nature of the 52 sovereign states, including Idi Amin's Uganda, Bokassa's Central African Republic, and Mobutu's Zaire. Now, this is a theme to which I'll return, but now I progress on to the other European empires. The German Empire, map 3. The German Empire was the shortest lived. It was extinguished in 1919. Most of it was concentrated in Africa. The size of German East Africa was nearly double that of Imperial Germany. The other German colonies included Southwest Africa, the Cameroons, and Togoland, and in the Pacific, the Germans possessed German New Guinea, otherwise known as Kaiser Wilhelmsland. Germany also occupied lesser territories in Asia and the Pacific, including Kalchai in China, the Bismarck Archipelago, part of the Samoan Group, and the Caroline, Mariana, and Marshall Islands north of the equator. For German settlers in the 20th century, only a few regions attracted settlers. Texas, for example, was much preferred over Togoland. Despite the brutal suppression of a revolt in Southwest Africa in 1904-1907 and an uprising in German East Africa in 1905, the Germans were no more, but no less, barbaric than the French in Algeria, the British in Kenya, or the Belgians in the Congo before 1908. And this theme connects with recent work by Caroline Elkins and David Anderson on the theme of genocide in Kenya, if genocide it was, and a common fallacy about the German colonial empire held that colonies were vital to Germany's economic prosperity. Far from being an asset, however, all of the German colonies before 1914, except the smallest, Togoland, which was productive in cocoa and rubber, required subsidies. German financiers, as well as immigrants, demonstrated a distinct preference for Eastern Europe and the Americas rather than for the colonies. There has been, I mentioned in passing, significant recent work on the German colonies, not least an excellent book in the historical monograph series. Now, the German Empire was a casualty of the First World War. In 1919, Germany lost her place in the sun, and with it, an unprofitable empire. In the 1930s, it seemed possible that some of the colonies might be restored or other territory in Africa ceded to Germany at the expense of Belgium and Portugal. It remains debatable how the social engineering of the Third Reich might have affected Black Africa and whether or not the Holocaust might have taken a slightly different direction with places such as East Africa available, as the Nazis called it, as a dumping ground for Jews and Gypsies. The only thing that can be said with certainty is that after 1945, the Germans were spared the trauma of decolonization. During the First World War, Britain and France emerged as major Middle Eastern powers and increased their colonial domains in Africa. But the public mood began to change. The European powers now paid lip service, at least, to the idea that colonies should be held in trust until the native peoples could stand on their own. Now, Germany not only lost her colonies, but through British propaganda, unjustly acquired the reputation of a barbarous power unfit to govern native peoples. The German colonies were overrun by the British with the help of Indian troops and by French, Belgians, South Africans, Australians, New Zealanders, and Japanese during the First World War. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled by the British and the French, and to a lesser degree by the Italians. The smaller colonial empires of the Dutch, the Belgians, and the Portuguese remained intact. So also did the larger empires of France and Britain, but for the transcendent reason that Britain happened to be the ally of Japan. Japan's policing of the eastern seas during the First World War enabled the British fleet to concentrate in European waters and thereby contributed to Allied victory and the maintenance of the Allied empires. Japan had defeated China in 1884-95 and Russia in 1904-95. Japan then annexed Korea in 1910, thus gate-crashing the white man's club of imperial domination. Could we have map 4, Japan in China? During the First World War, Japanese influence increased both in China and in the Pacific. In 1919, the German islands north of the equator became Japanese mandated territories. And could we shift to map 5, please, Sudhir? As in Germany, right. As in Germany in the 1930s, there emerged in Japan the doctrine that markets and raw materials were necessary for survival. After 1931, Japan occupied Manchuria. To the south, the greater co-prosperity sphere during the Second World War aimed to secure Japanese economic and political hegemony in Southeast Asia. In the early part of the war, the Japanese conquest of the Philippines, Malaya, and the East Indies, as well as control of Indochina, demonstrated the vulnerability of the Western regimes in Asia. Now, had Japan emerged victorious from the Second World War, Southeast Asia might have become part of an autarkic or self-sufficient economic bloc, not dissimilar from what the British had in mind with the Sterling area. The islands north of the equator would probably have been swamped with Japanese immigrants and might have been assimilated as an outlying territory of Japan. As it transpired, the Japanese left very little legacy in Micronesia and no tradition of language or education, no statues or parks. The most enduring feature of Japan's colonial experience was profound bitterness of the Koreans. This is, however, a provisional judgment because I have become aware during recent visits to Japan that there are major research projects being conducted by Japanese historians on the Japanese colonial empire and especially on the enduring and bitter legacy in China. In any event, after 1945, the loss of colonial possessions demonstrated that Japan, like Germany, did not need a place in the sun to recover economically. Now, the Italian Empire was another casualty of the Second World War. Could we have map 6, please, Sudhir? At the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, Ethiopia had not only remained free from European control, but had inflicted a humiliating defeat on the Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935-1936 aimed at explicitly revenge, as well as the establishment of a neo-Roman empire in East Africa. Italy's domain in East Africa included Eritrea, with some 5,000 Italians, and Italian Somaliland, 1 3/4 the size of Italy itself, with Somaliland including some 1,500 Italian settlers. Now, the numbers of Italians are significant because of the obsession with excess, what was called excess population, that characterized Italian public attitudes of the 1930s. The principal outlet for immigration was Libya, which Italy had won by conquest from Turkey in 1911. In the interwar years, Libya became Italy's fourth shore, and in 1938 had an Italian population of about 100,000, a figure that bears comparison, the 100,000, with the 20,000 whites in Kenya and the 400,000 Jews in Palestine and nearly 1 million Europeans in Algeria. Libya, under Italian rule, became one of the most urbanized countries of North Africa. The Italian fascist government built extensive harbors and roads, but resettled the local Muslim nomads nearer the desert, thereby reducing their numbers drastically, perhaps by half. These projects were pursued for the greater glory of the Italian fascist state, but to the end, they were a drain on the Italian budget and devastating to the indigenous populations. The Second World War destroyed another colonial system of much greater substance and longevity. Could we have map 7? The Dutch East Indies. The Dutch had held colonies since the 17th century. In the West Indies, the colonial possessions included Suriname. In the East Indies, in the vast Indonesian archipelago of 13,000 islands extending well over 3,000 miles from east to west, the Dutch had developed a colonial economy producing tobacco, tea, coffee, sugar, copra, tin, coal, rubber, and oil. In neither the late 19th century nor the First World War did the Dutch expand territorially. The Dutch Empire's scope remained the same in 1939 as it had been in 1815. But from the late 19th century onwards, the expansion of the economy brought to the East Indies a new Dutch population of businessmen and civil servants. By 1939, there were some 250,000 Dutch, which was well less than a quarter of the number of people who live in Dallas today. Now, many of these immigrants regarded the East Indies as their home. They raised their children there, they retired there, and they later became embittered during the post-war struggle leading to Dutch eviction. The size of the indigenous population had risen from 6 to 30 million in the 19th century and to some 70 million by 1940. Dutch rule, in part, reflected the problem of how to govern such a vast and changing population. The Dutch, from early on, preserved native dynasties and ruled through them. Like the British system, and in contrast with the French, the Dutch system was characterized by decentralization and indirect rule. The extent of Dutch influence in densely populated areas such as Java, as well as in the outlying areas, as you can imagine, was uneven. Now, the Japanese occupation in 1942 broke the continuity of Dutch rule. The Dutch were interned, and the Indonesian elite assumed administrative positions that they had previously been denied. By enlisting the support of both nationalist and Islamic leaders, the Japanese fostered the nationalist movement. After the war, the Dutch expected to reassert their control, but a long and acrimonious struggle ended when the United States sided with the nationalists and against their European allies. The new nation of Indonesia achieved independence in 1949, and in the West it was regarded as one of the two great Asian events of the year, the other being the emergence of the communist regime in China. We now come to the empires that endured into the latter part of the 20th century, the Belgian, the French, the British, and the Portuguese. Could we revert, please, Sudhir, to map 1? There were basic similarities. Each colony had what was called the steel frame of military, police, and administrative officers who maintained order and defended the frontiers, the characteristics of the colonial state. A European outpost in Africa might consist merely of a district officer, a few interpreters, and a small military detachment. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Portuguese Empire, more than the others, lacked both the military and administrative resources to go much beyond military occupation. Virtually all of the colonies developed revenue systems based on taxation of crops, which sometimes involved forced labor or its equivalent. Each colonial power exported a simplified form of its own system of government and law, and each colony possessed a system of justice, though this often amounted to unrestricted and arbitrary authority. As administrative units of the European powers, the colonies were also nascent states, each in the process of acquiring the modernizing characteristics of the states of Europe. Each colonial system invested in ports, roads, and railways, as well as in education and health measures, and against, for example, sleeping sickness. By mid-century, each had developed a network of government offices complete with files, typewriters, and telephones. Earlier, it probably did not much matter whether an African, for example, happened to be under one regime or another, but by mid-century, it mattered a great deal. By mid-century, the Belgian Congo had acquired the reputation of a model colony. It had not always been so. Under the autocratic rule of King Leopold 50 years earlier, the Congo had been notorious. Leopold ruled in the Congo in his own right and not as king of the Belgians. His regime was exploitative and rapacious. Africans were compelled to collect a quota of wild rubber under penalty of punishment that sometimes led to atrocities. Leopold demanded profits, but his administrative apparatus proved to be too weak to prevent abuses. In 1908, Belgium annexed the Congo to remedy the evils of her king. The immense colony of the Congo extended over nearly 1 million miles, 80 times larger than Belgium. The Belgians never numbered more than 100,000 settlers and administrators. The resources included copper, diamonds, and uranium, as well as tropical agricultural products such as rubber, palm oil, and cotton. Mining was the most valuable part of the economy, and by the standards of the time, Belgian rule was benevolent and efficient. No other colony had better labor conditions, health facilities, or primary education. No other, perhaps, was as paternalistic. Catholic missions provided for primary school attendance of over 50%, the highest in Africa, but few Africans went on to secondary schools and fewer still to universities. By the time of independence, the Belgian Congo had produced only 16 Congolese with university training. In December 1959, riots at Leopoldville shook the Belgian administration into a belated recognition of the strength of Congolese nationalism. The Belgians now made a fundamental miscalculation. Fearing that the troubles might escalate into the equivalent of the Algerian Revolution, and nevertheless assuming that the Congolese could not manage without them, the Belgians decided in favor of immediate independence on the 30th of June, 1960. The Congo quickly slid into anarchy, and the summer of 1960 will always be remembered as the time of one of the great disasters in European decolonization. the phrases Congo and post-colonial chaos became synonymous. The Portuguese Empire was the last to be liquidated, and it was, in every sense, an anachronism. Paradoxically, by the time that other European colonial regimes were in their death throes, the Portuguese had lost nothing until India seized Goa in 1961. And the question does arise in one's mind, was India a post-colonial imperial power with imperial ambitions despite an anti-colonial attitude? The principal colonies were the immediate territories, Portuguese colonies, were the immense territories of Angola in Western Africa and Mozambique in Eastern Africa. Now, these regions had been discovered by Vasco da Gama and others in the 15th century and held a vital place in the national psyche. Portugal's other colonies included Portuguese Guinea in Western Africa and minor territories throughout the world, including Macau off the coast of China near Canton. Now, in the first decade of the 20th century, the Portuguese were able to uphold their largely fictional claims in the vast hinterland of Angola and Mozambique only because the other colonial powers did not want to see the territories fall into the hands of their rivals. By 1910, no more than a tenth of either colony was under actual Portuguese control. The effective colonizing instrument that evolved in the shape of chartered companies or concessions dominated by British capital. To develop plantations, the companies relied on forced labor, which roused international humanitarian protest until the reform laws, labor laws of the 1920s. Portugal acquired the reputation of a harsh and despotic colonial power, almost competing with that of King Leopold's regime in the Congo. But the reason lay in Portugal's own poverty and the carrying over of 19th century labor practices into the 20th. Portugal herself was an underdeveloped country. The Portuguese had not experienced an industrial revolution and did not have a humanitarian movement. The critical period of modernization began with Salazar's new state in 1928. In the Renaissance, the new Portuguese state, the mystique of empire held a prominent place. Salazar presided over a period of colonial development that included the introduction of the telegraphs and telephones, ports and railways, hospitals and schools. By mid-century, the Portuguese colonies had been brought into line with the other European colonies, though observers commented on a 20-year time lag, rather like us visiting New Zealand today, 20 years as it was 20 years ago. There was less of a color bar than in any of the other European colonies, and the Portuguese viewed Angola and Mozambique as multiracial societies on the model of Brazil. They regarded the colonies as an integral part of the Portuguese state. But despite public subsidies to Catholic missions for education, by 1950, there were only negligible numbers of assimilated Africans in Angola and Mozambique. In 1961, a nationalist rising began in Angola, and for another decade, Portugal now fought rebel forces in all three of its African colonies. And it is a measure of the vitality of the Portuguese colonial mission that the military commitment reached nearly 200,000 troops, which represented a huge number of soldiers for a country with a population of only 8 million. The Portuguese devoted half of the national budget to the colonial war effort. And in the end, the Portuguese colonial empire in Africa died in 1974 as a result of revolution in Portugal and not defeat in the colonies. Now, before the Second World War, the French Empire stood as the only worldwide empire comparable to that of the British. Could we have map 8, please? In 1939, the French Empire extended over some 5 million square miles and had a population of 65 million. Algeria, administered directly as part of France, was the major colony of settlement and had nearly 1 million Europeans and over 6 million Muslims, with one of the highest rates of population growth in the world. Other parts of North African and Middle Eastern Empire included the protectorates over Tunisia and Morocco and the mandated territories of Syria and Lebanon. In Southeast Asia, the French held sway over Indochina. In the Pacific, France possessed Tahiti and various island groups, as well as in the Caribbean. In tropical Africa, the French domain was larger than that of any other power, extending from southern Algeria to the Congo and east to the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. French possessions further included French Somaliland, Madagascar, and island groups in the Indian Ocean. In all of these territories, the aim, or at least one distinct aim, since the time of the French Revolution, remained the same. France's republican heritage and civilization would be offered to all of its subjects, allowing them to become assimilated as French citizens. The empire would become an integral part of France. But by the early part of the 20th century, it had already become clear that it would be difficult, if not impossible, to assimilate entire societies in places such as Algeria, Indochina, and Black Africa. In 1924, there were only 94 Black African citizens in West Africa. So the project of transforming Arabs and Black Africans into Frenchmen obviously had its limits. The idea of assimilation, nevertheless, did not disappear. The French colonial minister, after the First World War, had called for investment to develop the colonies and to make the colonial economies interdependent with the metropolitan economy. Now, this is significant because the French proved themselves and are still proving themselves consistently more willing to provide money and to commit military forces than any of the other colonial powers. The universalist assumptions of the French Republican philosophy and the civilizing mission might be impractical, but economic and military commitment helped the French to produce a small, assimilated elite devoted to French civilization. Now, assimilation was as much cultural as it was political, but the assimilated Arabs, for example, in Syria, were not strong enough to prevent Syrian nationalists from defending their independence in 1945. The demise of France as a Middle Eastern power was a result of the Second World War, which also sapped French strength in Indochina. The year 1954 marked a humiliating and decisive French defeat at Dien Bien Phu and effectively ended France's empire in Asia. In the same year, the French government reinforced Algeria. One of de Gaulle's supreme achievements after his return to power in 1958 was the resolution of both the future of Algeria and the fate of the colonial empire. In 1958, he offered the Africans a clear choice. They could decide in favor of independence and a privileged place within the French community, with the continuation of economic and military assistance, or in favor of unfettered independence and the abrupt breaking of all links. Only Sékou Touré of Guinea chose to sever the bonds with France. The rest remained within the French Union, and in April 1961, de Gaulle survived a military revolt of the French army in Algeria and moved decisively towards Algerian independence. It was Algeria that captured the world's imagination, in part because of the movie, one that has been playing in recent years here in Washington, to see if there are any lessons to be learned for Iraq. The movie called The Battle of Algiers, which dramatically conveyed the message that nearly 500,000 troops, sophisticated weapons, and torture could not destroy a revolution aimed at national freedom. In 1962, de Gaulle proclaimed Algeria independent. Now, the British Empire differed from the French colonial system above all because of the possession of India and by the autonomous dominions. In map 9, please, Sudir, the end of the British Empire. At the turn of the 20th century, India constituted, as I have mentioned, an empire in its own right, with a territorial scope of nearly 2 million square miles and a population of 300 million. India alone had a population nearly 5 times that of the entire French colonial empire, and was a measure not merely of firepower, but of British confidence and prestige that India was administered, as I have mentioned, by fewer than 1,000 members of the Indian Civil Service. Now, the Indian Army, with a corps of 250,000 troops, made Britain the greatest military power in the East in the early part of the 20th century. During that time, the dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa had become self-governing and virtually independent. By formally marking the birth of the Commonwealth, the Statute of Westminster of 1931 merely recognized the actuality of nations of kith and kin freely associating with each other in self-interest. Now, until 1947, the Commonwealth remained an exclusive white man's club representing only a small part of a still vast empire that had reached its greatest territorial extent in the interwar years. In 1939, in the Caribbean, British colonies included Jamaica, Trinidad, British Guiana, Honduras, the Leewards, the Windwards, the Bahamas, and Bermuda. In the Pacific, the British administered Fiji, Tonga, and smaller island groups. In East and Southeast Asia, British possessions included Hong Kong, Malaya, Burma, Singapore, and parts of Borneo. In the Middle East, Mediterranean, and Indian Ocean, Britain ruled over Gibraltar, Malta, Cyprus, Palestine, Jordan, Aden, the Persian Gulf Protectorates, Ceylon, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. The African territories included the Gambia, Sierra Leone, the Gold Coast, Nigeria, the Cameroons, the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, British Somaliland, Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, Northern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, and Southern Rhodesia. And even this extensive list is by no means complete. The empire and the Commonwealth, I emphasize again, was a complex worldwide system stretching over some 12.2 million square miles, roughly 1/4 of the Earth's surface, that included territories acquired during every stage of colonization since the 16th century. Now, in retrospect, the interwar years represent the high noon of British colonialism, at least in the imagination. The district officer inspired trust in his subjects, as well as in the British public, that colonial rule was just and enlightened, as portrayed in the famous movie Saunders of the Rivers. The reality was much more complicated, but the fictional accounts usually conveyed the essential point that British rule depended on indigenous authority. The India Office, as well as the Colonial Office, monitored a decentralized and self-financing empire. In India, a system known as diarchy transferred to Indian hands authority in education, public health, public works, and agriculture, while reserving to the British the crucial departments such as justice, police, finance, and foreign affairs. In Africa, there emerged a similar design. In 1922, Sir Frederick Lugard's famous book, The Dual Mandate, developed the doctrine of indirect rule. In other words, of allowing local administration to be left in the hands of hereditary chiefs. As in India, the goal was to secure collaboration without weakening British control. The aim was the same in India, to win over the nationalists before they became embittered enemies of the British. For a while, it appeared that the strategy might succeed. In 1945, no one would have believed that the end would come so quickly, though it was already clear that India could not be held to the empire. The Labour government was committed to India's freedom, and in any event, economic and military weakness dictated retrenchment. Now, the dismantling of the empire began first in Asia by the granting of independence to India and Pakistan in 1947, and at about the same time to Ceylon and Burma. All except Burma remained in the Commonwealth providing a psychological cushion during the era of decolonization. In 1948, the British were driven out of Palestine, in part because of the intervention of the United States in favor of the Zionists and the creation of the State of Israel. Now, it might be tempting to regard these events as the beginning of a preordained decline and fall, but it did not seem so at the time to those who hoped to rejuvenate the empire in the Middle East and Africa. With India lost and Palestine shrugged aside, Africa would be developed as a replacement for India, and the oil of the Middle East would sustain Britain as a great world power. The collapse of the empire would be prevented by genuinely coming to terms with African and Middle Eastern nationalists as equals and not treating them as inferiors as in the earlier period. Such was the aspiration. And it is interesting to speculate how the end of the British Empire might have come about had it not been for the Suez Crisis of 1956, when the British government, under the leadership of Sir Anthony Eden and in collusion with France and Israel, attempted to turn back the clock in the Middle East by invading Egypt. The United States and the world at large in the United Nations protested, and indeed the United States conducted virtual economic warfare with the British and demanded withdrawal. Now, I should add that there are still defenders of the Suez operation, those who believe that the world would be a more peaceful and happier place if all of the Middle East were under European and American direct control. In any case, Suez demonstrated the extent of British military and financial weakness as well as dependence on the United States. In the wake of Suez, Harold Macmillan became Prime Minister and proceeded to liquidate the empire as a questionable economic asset and as a liability in Anglo-American relations. Above all, Harold Macmillan responded to the winds of African nationalism, the winds of change. He wanted to avert colonial wars and what he called a British Algeria in Central Africa. Independence for the Gold Coast and Malaya had been planned for 1957, and the goal already set for Nigerian independence in 1960. But it was Macmillan's colonial secretary, the Scotsman Ian MacLeod, who now dramatically stepped up the pace in the years 1959, 1961. And largely as a result of Ian MacLeod's accelerated timetables, many of the British dependencies gained independence in the early 1960s. Tanganyika, Cyprus, Sierra Leone, Kuwait gained independence in 1961, Uganda, Jamaica, Trinidad in 1962, Kenya and Zanzibar in 1963, and Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia and Malta in 1964. Now, the resolution of the Rhodesian problem was left to another generation 20 years later. But essentially, the empire, as represented by those great expanses of red on the map, had come to an end within a 4-year period from 1960, or to put it differently, in about a quarter of a century from 1945, marked at the end by the recall of all troops east of Suez in 1971. The calculation of decolonization on the British side was ruthless and entirely in British self-interest. A prolonged British presence would end in colonial conflict. It was better to end colonial rule sooner and hope for African goodwill and collaboration rather than later with the certainty of ill will and bloodshed. Now, in the aftermath of decolonization, the world has witnessed the rise and fall of such tyrants as Idi Amin of Uganda and, of course, Saddam Hussein. And it will be long debated how the European colonial powers might better have prepared the colonies for independence and the extent to which the new states are responsible for their own troubles. Now, many of the former colonies are hostages to the international economy, but the legacies of colonialism are cartographic, cultural, and aesthetic, as well as economic and political. For better or worse, the boundaries drawn by the colonial powers in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa over 100 years ago have proved to be remarkably durable. So also have the French, English, Spanish, and Portuguese linguistic blocks of the non-European world. French cultural influence probably exceeds that of the British, though in the world of sport, cricket, and soccer, the British have left a lasting legacy. The French, as I have mentioned, have proved far more willing than the British and others to commit troops and economic assistance to the former colonies, not least to those torn by ethnic and religious strife. And French cultural influence seems to have a more lasting impact than any of the other colonial regimes. Now, I end where I began with wishing good luck to the members of the Decolonization Seminar in pursuing these and other themes in their research here at the Library of Congress. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a few questions. And we have a mic. Please wait for the mic to come.
Is this on? Yeah, okay. I suppose that given the breadth and the scope of this talk, it may seem kind of churlish to complain that you haven't done enough, but I want to raise in particular the issue of the so-called white dominions and the role that they play in decolonization. It seems to me that you've replicated the traditional sort of historiographical story about where the dominions fit into the story of empire, and that is that they really are a separate case that need to be dealt with in a different way. But I wonder the degree to which that in fact is true. Shouldn't we also see places like Canada, Australia, New Zealand as territories that are in fact going through a process of decolonization as well, in some cases rather simultaneous, although not simultaneous to, but not as dramatic as the cases of in Africa and Asia. And I want to raise in particular the case of South Africa, which is, I think, particularly the wild card here, because that is identified as a white dominion in that classic sense. And yet, in fact, what happens in the South African case, although it's granted formal independence, it's granted to a white minority regime that ultimately fails and collapses by the 1980s, 1990s. So that's my question, comment.
Yes. About the only generalization that can be made is that the dominions in their constitutional and political evolution did follow a similar course of decolonization. And it is also true that the dominions, with the exception of South Africa, were in the forefront of the movement of decolonization. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, at the conference in San Francisco in 1945, were those who supported the anti-imperial declaration leading on to the trusteeship regime. And it is remarkable how the Canadians, and especially the New Zealanders, played a very prominent international part in the United Nations and the continuing international influence in the colonial empires. South Africa, as you rightly say, is distinct from all of these because of the Afrikaner regime attempting not only to preserve the racial balance in South Africa, but holding the line in South Africa until the fall of the apartheid regime at about the same time as the collapse of the Soviet Union. This was, we tend to forget, was one of the great surprises of the late 20th century, and it was not only the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was something that virtually no one, and certainly not myself, really thought would ever come in our own lifetime, the collapse of the apartheid regime in South Africa. Yes.
You said that the dissolution of the British Empire began in Asia, and my feeling has always been that the dissolution of the British Empire begins earlier, and the place where it begins is Ireland. And I would wonder if you would like to address the Irish case as an instance of decolonization.
Certainly. In that sense, what Dane remarked, that I was following the traditional historiography, because from a British point of view, Ireland as a precedent was one that they really wanted to forget, and they did not want this to become the example of the future of the colonial territories throughout the world. Now, we tend to look at the result of the decolonization process, especially because of partition in India and partition in Palestine, which was a continuation, in a way, of the story in Ireland a generation earlier. But it's rather easy to forget that partition was the solution that the British wanted to avoid at almost any cost. The partition of India meant among other things, the division of the Indian Army, and thus the weakening of the end of Britain's strategic position in Asia. In other words, partition represents the end of the line, a bankruptcy, a bankrupt policy, and yet this is what the British had to confront in India, and miraculously, through a combination of circumstances, not least the contribution made by two individuals, Nehru and Mountbatten, managed to keep both India and Pakistan in the Commonwealth. In the case of the partition of Palestine, the result is either happy or unhappy, depending on whether you are a Zionist or an Arab. And from the British, it was entirely an unhappy ending to the story. Yes.
Let me first thank you for the oversight. I'm from the Caribbean, and I'm from part of the still ongoing empire in the Caribbean, the French and the Dutch Empire in the Caribbean, a small island by the name of St. Martin. And like most kids of the elite class there, my whole history kind of mirrors that, in the sense that I went to the Netherlands and worked and was educated in the Netherlands, et cetera, et cetera. But you said one thing that I think maybe you can develop some more, the notion that all of these European empires develop a small co-opted elite class to in essence help them with their rule over these territories. I was wondering, how do you see the continuing development of this class now within the post-colonial period, and do you believe that to a certain extent these countries need to be decolonized from this co-opted class?
Since I was taking as my point of view, the vantage point of the European colonial powers, including the Dutch, as well as the British and the French, the result can be summed up in the word disillusion. It did not quite work out the way that they had hoped. In the case of the British, it is a very interesting case in point, because the British wanted to federate all of the British West Indies, including Trinidad. And so you can imagine, in your own imagination, what the Caribbean would look like today if there were a single federated territory of the West Indian former colonies, including Trinidad and Jamaica as the powerhouses of the Federation, rather than the fragmented island territories that we know today in the Caribbean. Now, the problem was that neither Jamaica nor Trinidad wanted to pay the cost of the Federation, and that was the underlying cause, and this was what the British and the other Europeans discovered, that they had no actual control over the elites that they had fostered. Yes.
From the sweep of historical introduction that you gave in, could we sort of draw a parallel with Williams' theory on slavery and capitalism, wherein he says that capitalism had to destroy slavery in order not to be destroyed by it? So the colonizers had to destroy colonialism in order not to be devoured by it. Would that be something that you have been considering lately?
Sure that I understood the question, but I see here two people that did. Philippa, would you like to respond?
It's an interesting idea to think about Eric Williams's notion of slavery having to disappear in order for capitalism to rise in its, the phoenix that rises from the ashes, as it were, of slavery, right? To think about whether, in order for the modern world order, I think that's what you're suggesting, to appear, for colonialism to be destroyed. I think my response to that would be, and I don't know whether you'd agree, Roger, that I'm not sure colonialism has entirely disappeared. That I think that the term post-colonialism, as Anne McClintock has argued, is a term that can disguise quite a lot. Not only are there still places which bear the yoke of colonialism, although it's quite a small number, but the very fact that Roger was talking at such eloquent length about the kinds of problems that exist in the contemporary world, which are themselves the legacies of a series of European colonialism, suggests to me that either that destruction is not yet complete, or that isn't going to happen. So I think that would be my response, Dane.
No, that's right.
Add that there is no more lasting and provocative thesis than the one put forward by Eric Williams, that the slave trade ended not for humanitarian reasons, but because of the collapse of the decline of the sugar interest. In other words, declining economic reasons. And there's no better way to get a discussion going in a graduate seminar than to introduce the Eric Williams thesis. John.
It's clear from your lecture that empires come and empires go, but is imperialism with us always?
I'll only say that I hope in the case of Iraq that it will not last much longer. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.